Wow. Thank you, Quinlan. Thank you, chamber singers, musicians, jazz ensemble. I mean, this was like a standing ovation performance, but you all are so used to this level of musical brilliance that you just give a nice round of applause. But I'd say standing ovation value to all the performers. Yeah, okay, that's good. It's a little late, but it's good. I think I should just quit now, right? That's it. I know my job is to be brief. When Lily invited me, she sent me an email. Your speech, she wrote, will take place after our jazz band, meaning after the good part, and before diplomas are awarded, meaning before the best part. Then she wrote, the length of your speech is 10 minutes. Please do not exceed 15 minutes. So I'm on the clock, and I'll try not to disappoint you, Lily and Arjun, Shetty. I want to thank the Special Olympics team and the Best Buddies team in a special way. I want to thank all the students here for being part of the most inclusive generation in history, and I mean that. All of you. My wife Linda and I became BCC parents in 2003. I was already the nephew of a former BCC graduation speaker, then a senator of the United States in 1959. In 2007, my sister was the commencement speaker, so I've got 3 more siblings to go, and then you'll have had the whole family, and then my wife will step in so we can continue the tradition. But we're very proud, all of us, to be a part of the BCC family, and very humbled by the talent and commitment that Dr. Jones spoke of so eloquently in sharing all the stories of academic excellence, of artistic excellence, of service and social and community excellence that is represented by all these extraordinary blue gowns, men and women, for intelligence, for creativity, for learning, for others. It's an honor to be with you. So, very briefly, one of the most important lessons I learned in my life, I learned from high school students. You may be so close to this lesson, I was when I was your age, that you might not even have noticed it, although I heard hints of it in your remarks already today. I taught at a high school where the students were obviously the same age as you. They had some good days and bad days. Sometimes they were hardworking, sometimes they were rebellious, sometimes they were loving, sometimes they were mean. Sometimes they were affectionate, sometimes distant, sometimes in love, sometimes in loss. But my students also had a lot of challenges. Maybe some will be recognizable to you, but maybe some will not. More than half lived below the American poverty line. Almost 30% of my students moved every single year, meaning that they and their families were almost always on the move, always in flight. They lived in neighborhoods where violence and chaos sometimes seemed ordinary. They grew up in the middle of what you may have heard about, the crack epidemic of the 1980s. They did high-risk things, sometimes things that I was amazed and stunned by. High-risk things with sex, with drugs, with violence, with each other. Gangs were attractive to my students. They offered something important. One of my students I was standing next to during dismissal one day, and he was shot standing right next to me. Another, who happily survived, was shot 7 times a few years later at point-blank range. My students flirted with all kinds of risk, even with disaster, even with death. At first I thought, this is a high school full of kids who are making huge mistakes. I needed to help them, guide them, corral them, save them. Do your homework, focus on reading, go to the library. You can break out, you can achieve, you can do the things that will make this all be a distant memory. I even thought of the idea of how to make a student into a nerd. You see, It was kind of a joke, but kind of not, because nerds had a chance. Many of my students, it seemed, didn't. But after a few years of mostly frustration and mostly failure, I would say, as a high school counselor and teacher and after-school coordinator, I started to look a little closer. And here's what I saw. I saw people your age and younger than you. And all they wanted was to belong. They wanted to matter. They wanted to be included. My students wanted the one thing the society around them didn't offer them, a place where they felt that they mattered. The more I looked, the more I saw kids who felt that chaos, racism, indifference had robbed them of the one thing that mattered most to them. And to my shame, I hadn't focused on it at all. I was all about the tasks. So this became clear to me when I formed an after-school group of young men. They were the at-risk kids. That's the language we used in those days. Young men who were at risk of dropping out, or so the teachers thought. 25 guys, freshmen to seniors. I encouraged them to join an after-school group and voluntarily come to meet. And I used the best educational strategy ever developed: pizza. Everybody knows it works. We just don't use it enough, I think. So we started this after-school group, and they decided to name the group. They didn't call it the at-risk group. They didn't call it the on the precipice group. They called it the Young Men's Leadership Group. We held conversations about classes, about teachers, about report cards, about after-school activities, about what was going on in the neighborhood. And I kept harping on how could we focus on getting our grades up. They said they wanted to focus on getting jackets. They wanted to raise the money to get blue jackets that were the colors of our school with their names on them and the crest that they would create for the Young Men's Leadership Group. They wanted to have the symbol that all the other kids, whether they were on television or out in the world, had, a symbol of belonging. Belonging wasn't something they needed to earn in class. It was something they needed to have a reason to try. That switch in my mind all of a sudden triggered a whole sense of what it meant to be in high school and what it meant to carry the lessons, the great lessons you've learned at BCC forward. Once they had their jackets, they could do anything. They could raise money in the neighborhood, they could paint houses, they could run dances, they could have basketball teams, they could volunteer, they could mentor, they could increase their grades, they could do anything. As long as they knew, as long as they'd been told, as long as someone, whether it was a peer or a teacher, had reinforced for them that they mattered, that they belonged. I submit to you that that lesson is probably one you learned at BCC. You can probably remember moments in these last 4 years where you really felt in, where you really belonged, where you were really part of the group. And I'm guessing you can also remember moments where you didn't. And I'm guessing when you felt in, everything was possible. And when you felt out, nothing was good. It's the same truth for most of us in the audience. When we feel, when we know, when we experience a sense in which we belong and our hopes and dreams matter to the world, anything's possible. And when we don't, it seems as though almost nothing is. Look at you here today. You've all got your jackets, right? You got your blue gowns, you've got your caps, you've got your tassels, ready to move them. Soon, if I can stop talking, you'll have your diplomas. Remember what you feel like right now. You're at an extraordinary moment. Your parents and grandparents and brothers and sisters have been dreaming about this, praying for this, hoping for this, begging you to come to this moment. Yeah, I know, waking you up, the whole thing, the early buses, I know. But remember this moment. Remember what it feels like right here, right now, to be at the moment where you will be recognized. I submit to you, you will come across this stage not just because you earned your diploma, but because someone told you you were worth it, that it was worth your while, that it was worth it. You yourself were worth enough to give the effort to make this moment a success. I hope that you remember this lesson as you go forth from here, because you're about to enter a new world, whether it's college or work or years off or other kinds of things. You're going to be a newbie where you go. You're going to feel a little bit like you're not in. No matter how gifted you are, there's going to be a moment at which you have to take the chance to join. And there are going to be moments when you have the option to make others feel included too. There'll be a temptation, because sometimes superiority feels really good, and superiority depends on one thing: making someone else inferior. And being in sometimes makes you feel like the only way you can be in is if someone else is out. But that's not true. Today, everybody's in, and it really feels good. Nobody's excluded, and it really feels good. It feels like an energy frequency you want to hold on to and sustain and feel and be a baron today, forever. Here's the catch. Your choice about whether to include others or not include others doesn't just matter to you. It matters now to the country, too. Because we live in a time, I believe that the real challenge facing your generation right now is not weapons of mass destruction. That's the challenge some of us in the audience grew up hearing about. I submit it's attitudes of mass destruction. It's fear of difference. It's fear of the future. It's fear of the other. The question of whether this nation becomes an inclusion nation or an exclusion nation is right now hanging in the balance. And the outcome is not certain. I don't have to tell you what's going on around you, not just in this country, but around the world. The outcome is not certain. It is not a passive question as to whether you will simply feel included or excluded in your next set of classes or in your job. It's an outcome on which the future of our country, if you ask me, depends. So I have a simple request. When in doubt, choose to include. Simple. It's always the better choice. Now, if you're in need of a role model, let me offer you one as my last point. A role model for me is a young man named Donal Page. Donal is one of the 5 million people who call themselves Special Olympics athletes. They have been served by the students of BCC, by Lily and her compadres on Saturday mornings in Bethesda, and they're being served in rural China and in rural India, and they're leading and creating examples in Malawi and in Panama and all over the world. What Donal has in common with all of those people is that he has been labeled as a person with an intellectual disability. Now, because of that label, sometimes that means he is almost automatically excluded, almost without us even noticing it. Because of that label, he's often ridiculed. He's often taunted. He's even bullied. Even here, I'm sorry to say, even in Washington, D.C., even in Bethesda, his compatriots, his colleagues, often feel the sting of humiliation. BCC started the effort to end the world of the use of the word retard, and yet it persists today for Donal and many more like him. I started working with people like Donal many years ago, and what struck me the most about people with intellectual challenges who were coming to the fields of Special Olympics is how open they were, how trusting, how welcoming, how delightfully joyful in their relationships. And I started to wonder to myself, why do we so often reject the people and the things that carry the secret of belonging? Why is it that the people who are so endlessly receptive are so often rejected? So this is how Donald taught me. He was a healthy little boy. He still lives in rural Ireland. His parents are dairy farmers. He's one of 8. At the age of 2, he had a very serious brain infection, and from being fully healthy, he almost died 2 or 3 times, but after about 3 months in the hospital, his mother and father took him home, no longer having any speech, no longer any mobility, no longer the capacity to care for himself, but they committed to raising him. Donald Page, at the age of 18, was invited to come to the Special Olympics World Games to compete in motor activities in Dublin, Ireland. I got a call the day before from the president of Ireland saying she'd like to come out and watch some Special Olympics events. I responded quickly, let's go to the track. We've got athletes running in near Olympic times. Or the swimming pool, we've got athletes doing the 1,500 meters, we've got athletes doing medleys, butterfly. No, the president's assistant said she wants to watch motor activities. Now, motor activities is for those with the most severe challenges, the highest level of difficulty for them. I agreed and, of course, showed up and entered into a hall about this size with a crowd about half the size we have here, and the first athlete brought out to participate was Donald Page. At the age of 18, in his wheelchair, with his coach pushing him, he was wheeled to the front of the room, and the gun went off for his event, the beanbag lift. His challenge, to put his hand on the bag, to lift the bag, and to move it. I sat fidgeting next to the president, awkward, uncomfortable. What would she think? How would she react? As the event started, Donald took in the room and looked around, and then you could see him begin the process of moving his hand over to the bag. There was only one problem. His arm wouldn't go. And we sat there in stunned silence as he efforted and tried again, but his hand wouldn't go. 3 minutes went by. The whole room in silent, awkward, I would almost say embarrassed quiet. And then at the 3-minute mark, Donald's hand finally flopped onto the bag. And a cheer went out from the crowd, and a louder cheer. Donald's parents had driven up 5 hours to watch him. They were in the back, cheering. And then Donald's hand, shaking slowly, began to lift the bag. And slowly and slowly and slowly, the bag began to move. About 15 minutes in, Donald crossed the midline with his hand on the bag. And at the 18-minute mark, now with standing ovations, cheers, screams and yells like it was the Final Four, Donald Page completed his event. I was standing, I looked over at the president standing next to me. She was standing, cheering. Tears were streaming down her face. Tears were streaming down my face. I thought to myself, I had it wrong. I thought we needed to impress the president. I thought we needed to show some kind of achievement to the president. I didn't trust that it could come from this man. No rock star body, no fame or wealth to make you notice him, no power to attract your attention, but he did the hardest thing in life. He showed up and he wasn't afraid. He showed up just willing to do what he could do, nothing more. No shame, no capacity for anyone to judge him, just himself. No superiority, no separation, no fear. Now, you may think LeBron James is a good athlete. He is. Maybe Bryce Harper, Elena Delle Donne. There's a lot of people to be fans of in Washington these days. But I promise you, none of them is the equal of Donald Page. None of them is the equal of Donald Page. So graduates, I dare say you're leaving BCC, but you are not leaving the challenge of learning how to be agents of inclusion. The lessons are pretty simple. You've learned them here already. Do your best, be fearless, don't exclude, no superiority necessary, show up as you are. These lessons will come through to you, I hope, in a way that will transform our country. And we're counting on you to end the divisiveness, end the bullying, end the fear that we see all around us today. We want schools that teach children the lessons of the mind, but also the lessons of the heart. Purpose, empathy, grit, resilience, compassion. Your generation can create those schools. We want to make this country a place where people with and without intellectual and developmental differences learn to play together so we can raise a unified generation. Your generation can ensure that someday every school in the country will have a Special Olympics unified sports team alongside the boys team and the girls team. Everyone will grow up playing unified and living unified too. We want to make America a place where health care isn't denied to anybody because of any condition, right? Everyone's included in the health care system. Where lost people and homeless people and refugees aren't bullied. Where people who need help are offered the help through encounters, through openness, through trust, and through recognition. We want to create an inclusion nation, not a bullying nation, a unified nation, not a blame nation. When you live inclusively, you do this no matter how small the act, you pay it forward. Someone will notice someday. Someone will remember someday the moment at which your eyes met those eyes and said, I want you in. So, this is your time, graduates. All these parents are dying like crazy to scream and yell and holler and say, I'm proud of you. You should be just as equally dying to look up into these rafters and say, thank you, Mom, thank you. Anybody who mothered me, anybody who fathered me, no matter what your title, no matter what your name, you want to be able to say thank you, and I just want to say the world needs you. You have your moment to tilt the arc of history, as Dr. King would say, towards justice. It just takes a few words. I choose to include. Include, include, include. Congratulations, parents.